China's breakthrough, the birth of paper money. Once upon a time, while Europe still weighed its dreams in metal, the East began to imagine something lighter, something radical, something that would make even emperors nervous. Paper, thin, fragile, temporary, the complete opposite of gold. And yet, somehow, it would come to rule the world. It began quietly, as all revolutions do, not with blood or banners, but with inconvenience. Gold was too heavy, silver too scarce. Merchants along the rivers of China, silk traders, spice sellers, tax collectors were tired of dragging their fortune through mud and mountains. And so, necessity whispered what imagination dared not yet say. What if money didn't need to weigh anything at all? It was the Song dynasty around the 10th century, a civilization already centuries ahead of its time. They had the compass, gunpowder, printing presses, bureaucracy, art, and now the most subversive invention of all, trust on paper. At first, it was simple. Merchants deposited their coins with local traders, who issued handwritten receipts, promises that the metal would be there when they returned. Those slips of ink and fiber began to circulate. People realized they didn't need to see the silver to believe in it. They only needed to believe in the stamp, the seal, the system. And just like that, belief became currency. The first government to see this power wasn't blind. It was ambitious. The state took the idea, wrapped it in bureaucracy, and called it jiaozi, official paper money. Backed by the empire's authority, not by metal. It was the beginning of a financial theology more powerful than gold itself. For the first time, value could be written, printed, multiplied. What once took caravans, now took a brush. What once moved through deserts, now moved through mines. The world had never seen anything so dangerous or so brilliant. Because the true power of paper wasn't in what it was in what it wasn't. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't limited. It wasn't bound by geography or geology. It was pure abstraction, an idea disguised as an object. Gold demanded you worship the earth. Paper invited you to worship imagination. But imagination is a treacherous god. It gives birth to innovation and illusion, to freedom and control. And China, glorious and wise as it was, would learn both sides of the spell it had cast. At first, it worked perfectly. Trade expanded faster than armies could march. Merchants traveled lighter. Cities thrived. Taxes flowed like rivers. The empire became an organism of efficiency, each note a heartbeat of economic rhythm. Paper had freed value from the tyranny of metal. But freedom, as ever, came with temptation. If paper could represent gold, why stop there? Why not print more paper and make more wealth? After all, it was only ink. And so began humanity's oldest financial delusion that value could be created by decree. The government printed more and more, until one day, the people realized that the symbols they held no longer symbolized anything. The great irony of paper money was born in China's markets. When the first citizen tried to trade his notes for silver, and the banker smiled politely and said, "Not today." Trust evaporated faster than ink could dry. Inflation devoured confidence. The same empire that had invented financial freedom was now drowning in its own imagination. But still, the idea refused to die. Ideas never do. Even as dynasties fell, even as new rulers swore they'd return to metal, the temptation lingered. Because once humanity had tasted the sweetness of convenience, it could never go back to the bitterness of burden. Gold was honest. Yes, brutally honest. But honesty is heavy. Paper was deceitful but light. And the world has always chosen speed over truth. Centuries later, A Venetian merchant named Marco Polo would arrive in China. He'd see the strange miracle first-hand money made of bark and ink. Carrying the authority of an emperor, he couldn't believe it. In his journals, he wrote as though he'd witnessed sorcery. The Great Khan causes the bark of trees, made into paper, to pass for money, and no one dares to refuse it. To a European mind, it was blasphemy. To an Eastern mind, it was progress. To history, it was inevitability. Because paper money wasn't just a tool, it was a philosophy. It said value isn't in what we touch, but in what we trust. It replaced matter with meaning, metal with metaphor. And once that door was opened, the human mind and the human market would never close it again. Of course, faith in paper was fragile. It required discipline, restraint, balance qualities rarely found in empires at their peak. As dynasties rose and fell, paper became both their miracle and their curse. When wisely managed, it built prosperity. When abused, it unleashed chaos. During times of war, emperors printed fortunes to pay soldiers. During peace, they printed more to fund vanity. Each note whispered the same dangerous comfort: we can always make more. But every whisper has an echo. Prices soared. Trust eroded. Merchants fled. By the 15th century, the great paper experiment had collapsed under its own abundance. Gold returned heavier, slower, smug like an old god reclaiming its altar. Yet, even in defeat, paper had already won. Because it had planted a seed in the human psyche, the idea that money was not a thing, but a story, a shared fiction, powerful enough to move armies, build cities, and topple kings. That seed would cross continents. It would sleep in the soil of forgotten manuscripts. Until centuries later, it would awaken again, this time in Europe. Disguised as progress, cloaked in reason, ready to reinvent belief itself. But before that awakening came imitation. Every merchant, every monarch who heard rumors of China's flying money wanted to understand its secret. How could an empire so vast be governed not by gold, but by promises? They studied the system with suspicion and envy. Europe saw danger, but also opportunity. Because paper could do what gold never could: expand infinitely, invisibly, instantly. And Europe, already dreaming of conquest and commerce, knew exactly what to do with infinity. But centuries before that greed found its form, China had already glimpsed the paradox of creation. To print wealth was to print chaos. To invent freedom was to invent control. Paper had liberated trade, but also enslaved it to trust. And trust, fragile and finite, was now the new gold. It's almost poetic that the civilization which invented balance in philosophy, medicine, and art would struggle to balance its own invention in finance. For a while, the empire managed. It recalibrated, standardized, reissued new notes under stricter laws. It worked for a time, because that's what humanity does best: patch the illusion just enough to keep believing in it. But eventually, the same truth returned: no empire can print discipline. Paper money required something gold never did: wisdom. And wisdom is rarer than metal. Yet despite every failure, every collapse, every lesson paid in inflation and despair, the invention endured. Because paper had changed something fundamental, it had altered humanity's relationship with time. Gold was static. It demanded patience. Paper was dynamic. It invited movement. You could lend it, borrow it, multiply it, destroy it. A symphony of circulation that turned markets into living organisms. And once economies began to breathe, there was no going back to stone and silence. Gold had measured wealth. Paper created it, or at least created the illusion that it could be created. And that illusion was enough to reshape the world. The Chinese didn't invent greed. They merely gave it wings. When Marco Polo returned to Venice and spoke of money made of paper, European bankers laughed. They called it madness. Yet centuries later, they would build entire empires upon the same madness, but dress it in logic, law, and ledgers. History, as always, doesn't move in straight lines. It loops like a pattern on silk, repeating, reflecting, reinterpreting the same desire in different disguises. The desire for more, the dream of control, the illusion of permanence. Paper money didn't destroy the old order. It revealed it. It showed that even gold, that untouchable symbol of certainty, had always been a story we told ourselves. A prettier fiction, perhaps, but fiction nonetheless. Paper simply made the lie explicit and therefore, strangely, more honest. It said, "I am nothing but belief. Handle me with care." And belief, for all its fragility, proved far more powerful than metal. Because you can steal gold, you can melt it, hide it, bury it. But belief, once it spreads, can't be contained. And so, as the centuries turned, the fragile paper invention of a single empire would cross oceans, reshape continents, and quietly rewrite the laws of civilization. Every contract, every loan, every investment, every promise, all carried its DNA, the whisper of the East, that value is nothing more than collective faith in an idea. It was a lesson humanity would forget and relearn, and forget again, each time more expensively than before. Because when you replace gold with trust, you must protect that trust with more than armies. You must protect it with honesty. And honesty, like gold, is always in short supply. Perhaps that's why the story of paper money feels less like invention and more like prophecy. The prophecy that humanity would eventually abandon substance for symbol and confuse the two forever. Today, our screens glow with numbers that don't exist, backed by reserves that no longer matter, promised by institutions that tremble at their own creations. It all began here with ink, paper, and audacity. The Chinese called it jiaozi, but history calls it something else. The moment humanity learned to monetize imagination, a thin sheet of belief, a fragile rebellion against gravity, a piece of paper that told the world, you don't need gold to rule you, only need faith. And faith, once written down, is almost impossible to erase. That was China's greatest invention, not the compass, not the gunpowder, not even the Great Wall, but the idea that value could exist purely in the human mind, that an empire could be built on trust alone. Of course, trust can burn faster than paper, and it often does. But in the quiet brilliance of that first printed note, the fate of the modern world was already sealed. A world not of metal, but of meaning, not of scarcity, but of stories. A world where wealth would no longer glitter, it would whisper. And in that whisper, the echo of gold could still be heard distant, jealous, defeated, watching as paper took flight and carried humanity into a future too light to ever touch the ground again.